Hello and welcome to yet another tutorial by Davies Media Design. My name is Michael Davies, and in today's tutorial I'll be showing you how to add lettering to a skyline photo here. As you can see, it makes it appear as if the text is 3D and integrated into the skyline. I'll be using GIMP 2.10.14 for this tutorial, which at the time of this tutorial is the latest version of GIMP. But of course, before I get into that, I want to direct you guys over to my website at daviesmediadesign.com. As always, I have tons of GIMP and Inkscape tutorials on here, as well as my GIMP book of layers and GIMP and Inkscape help articles, so definitely check that out. You can enroll in my GIMP 2.10 Masterclass from beginner to pro photo editing on Udemy. You can enroll in any of my Skillshare classes by visiting gimpschool.com, and you can get more with a premium membership to Davies Media Design. Your membership includes access to my GIMP Help Center app, as well as ebooks including my new GIMP Book of Layers, as well as premium tutorials not found on YouTube. You could start your subscription with a 7-day free trial, and I'll include a link to this as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. So here's the photo I'll be using for today's tutorial. This is a photo of the skyline in Manhattan in New York City. This is from Pixabay. Of course, I'll include a link to this, and just click free download and go with the 1920 by 1280 download and click download there. Of course, here is the final result. So we're going to make it appear today as if the lettering is ducking behind the buildings and the buildings are casting a shadow on the letters here. So it creates this really cool 3D effect. So let's dive in here. I'll start by going to File, Open Recent, and I'm going to just open up this photo here. Of course, if you haven't opened your photo yet, just go to File, Open, and search for the photo on your computer. So right now, obviously, this photo is right side up, and we need to rotate it to get that really cool effect that I had going in the final result that you guys saw. So what I'll have to do is rotate this photo, and I can do that by coming over here to the Rotate tool. And down here under the tool options, you have a few options here, so you can go with the layer option. But if you're using GIMP 2.10.14 or newer, there is another option here called Image. So if I click on that, that's going to allow me to rotate the entire composition, including the canvas, and not just the layer that we're working on. So we don't want to rotate the image layer, we want to rotate the entire composition. So with this transform set to image, now I'll just click on this and drag. And if I hold my shift key, that's going to allow me to drag this in 15-degree increments. And I want to rotate this until it gets to 90 degrees, as you can see right here. So we want the photo to be completely rotated over so that all of the buildings are now facing out to the right here instead of facing up. Once I've done that, I'll hit rotate. And now our entire image, including the canvas, is going to be rotated. If you're using an older version of GIMP and you only have the layer option, you can always rotate the layer, use the crop tool, just check the allow growing feature and crop the image with the brand new aspect ratio here, and then you're just gonna have to go to image, crop to content. So it's gonna take you a couple of extra steps if you're using an older version, but you can still do this with an older version of GIMP. So now that my image is rotated here, I'm going to come over and grab my text tool. And you can see my font here is set to Work Sans Bold. So you can choose whatever font you want using the font options here. And then I have the size set to 313 right now. And you can also see that I've decreased the amount of spacing between the different lines of text. So you'll see that come into play here as I start to type. I'm gonna also make sure my text color is set to white here and click OK. And then I'll click on my composition, and with my caps lock key on, I'm just gonna type new. Hit the enter key, York for the second line, hit the enter key again, and then city for the third line. And then I can hold the alt key, and that's going to allow me to drag my text around here. So I can position this manually, or I can come over here to my alignment tool, click on the text box here, make sure align to is relative to image. And then I'm just going to, you can center this in the middle of the photo like so, and then also center this in the middle vertically, so I did horizontal and vertically there. So I'll hold Control and zoom in, and what I can do next is I can just decrease the opacity of this text layer, and we can see where this sits in terms of all of the buildings in the photo. So right now I actually like where this is sitting, so we're gonna work on making the lettering disappear behind these buildings for the main portion of this photo. So let me turn the opacity back up for now. The next thing I need to do is add a layer mask to my text layer, and this is going to allow me to make parts of my text disappear without making them disappear entirely. So we'll be able to bring these back if we screw up a part that we're trying to erase. So I'll right click on here and go to Add Layer Mask. And under Initialize Layer Mask 2, I'll choose White Full Opacity and click Add. So that gives us a layer mask on this text layer here. And next I'll come over and grab my paintbrush tool, and I'm just gonna click this little icon here to reset my colors to black and white. And I'll hold Control and zoom in on the parts I wanna start erasing. So we'll start by first turning down the opacity here and making sure we're still on the layer mask. So we'll turn it down so that we can see the lettering still, but so that we can also clearly see what's going on with the buildings here. Another thing I can do is I can adjust the levels of my image so it's a little bit easier to see the buildings in the image, and therefore it's a little bit easier to erase those parts of the buildings on our text. So what I'll do is click on that main photo layer and just duplicate it. And then I'll come over here to Colors, Levels. And I'm just going to adjust my levels here. So if I bring this slider in, it's going to make it darker, and that's not what I want to do. So I'll bring in the highlight slider here, and I'll also adjust the midtones, and you can see that now parts of those buildings are really starting to show. And that's just going to make this easier to edit. So click OK. So now we can come back over here to our original layer mask, hold Control and zoom in, grab our paintbrush tool again. And now with the paintbrush tool, I actually want the hardness turned all the way up to 100. And you can also adjust the size of your paintbrush using the left or right brackets on your keyboard. And you do have to be clicked on your composition for this to work. So you can see left bracket is going to size it down, right bracket will size it up. So I'm just going to adjust the size of my brush as I go around my image, and I'll start right here. And the thing that makes this tutorial so easy is that obviously the buildings are going to be box shaped for the most part. So that's going to make it really easy to come in here and erase everything. So I'll click on this to start. So I just clicked once, I'll hold the Shift key. That allows me to draw in straight line mode, and then I can click again, and that'll erase everything along that straight line. I'll hold Control and use my mouse wheel to zoom in a bit. So we're just going to erase the detail parts right here, and then we'll erase around this object here, which is more circular. And then we'll come down here, and I'm going to click once right there, hold the Shift key, click again, and I'll have to decrease the size of my brush a little bit to get this corner properly. We don't want to erase too much of it. And then we're also going to grab this portion of the building, so I'll click on here, hold Shift, click again, and that will erase that. So I can increase the size of my brush now and just erase everything in between. There we go. Hold Control and zoom in. Make sure we erased all of this stuff right here. Hold Control and zoom out. So now if I come over here and increase the opacity, you can see that's what that text is going to look like behind the building. And I do actually want to make sure that this part of the building is also erased, so I'll just decrease the size of this. I'm sorry, decrease the opacity. And now I'm going to increase the size of my brush and just erase any parts of the building here that the text is overlapping on. It is a little hard to determine what is a building and what is something else when you're zoomed in a lot because it's so pixelated there, but that looks pretty good. So move on, and I'm just going to do this throughout the image. And the hardest part of this tutorial is just deciding which parts of the buildings you want the text to go behind, which buildings in particular in the skyline. So we've got two candidates here. We've got this building here and this one here. I think I'll erase both of these buildings here. I don't want to erase too much of the text because I still want the word itself to be legible. So actually I might keep that part there, and let me just zoom in. I do want to erase this part. So I'll increase the size of my brush. And obviously the more precise you get with the erasing here, the better the final result will look. All right, that looks pretty good. Next, we're going to work on the E. So we need to determine which buildings we want the E to go behind. And I think this little building right here is just going to work on its own. And I'll probably leave the rest of the E. So we'll just hold Control, zoom in, and erase. And I'll hit Control Z. I don't want to erase too much here. So I'll hold the Shift key to draw that in straight line mode. So there's the E. Now we'll move on to the W here. So we'll have the W go behind this building right here. And whatever buildings you have the text going behind is ultimately up to you guys. So if you guys want to do this differently than the way I'm doing it here, go ahead. I definitely did it differently the first time I did this tutorial on my own. So it will look different every time and for every person depending on your preferences. So now I need to determine if I want this going behind another building here. So maybe I'll have it go behind parts of this building right here and this one as well right there. All right, so there's the first line of text. Now I'm going to move on to the other two lines of text. The process is going to be the same for these two. It's just a matter of figuring out which buildings you want the text to dip behind and then just going in there and erasing that part on the layer mask. So I'm just going to fast forward through this part to keep this tutorial from getting too long. All right, so I finished erasing the letters so that they all look like they're going behind the buildings here in the photo. And I couldn't really decide what to do with the Y here because the building is so large and it obstructs the bottom portion. In the original one that I did, the Y sort of dipped in the middle here between the buildings. This one, the way the letters were positioned, that wouldn't really work, so I just decided to go ahead and erase the part that ducks behind the building there. So I think you can still tell what's going on there, but you guys can do something differently with that Y if you decide you don't like that. But now that I have all my lettering completed here, the next thing I want to do is add the shadows. So I want to make this look even more real and more interactive by having the buildings cast a shadow on the letters. This part's pretty easy to do, so what I'll do is create a new layer. And I'll just name this building, and let me make sure my caps lock key is off. building shadows. We're going to fill this with transparency and click OK. So while we're on the building shadows layer, we're going to switch our color to black. And we're also going to decrease the hardness of our brush here to something probably below 50%. And I'll hold Control and zoom in. And we can increase the size maybe a little bit here. So anywhere where you want a building shadow, we're now going to be on this layer and just paint the shadow in the general shape of the building. It's okay if it overlaps at first. We're going to fix that later. And I'm just going to stick to shadows on the right side in the bottom portion of buildings. So we won't add one here, but I'll add one right here. And I'll use the space bar to move over, so I'll add one right here as well. And so I'm just loosely following the shape of the building here. And same with right here. So I'll use the space bar to move over and continue this process. So we won't paint one here, and we'll move on. We're not going to paint one up top here, but I will paint one on the side. And then I'll come over here and we'll paint one along the entire border of this. And then we'll move on to the third line and do the same here. And I'll hit Control Z. I'll actually redo this one. So I can always use the Shift key to draw in straight line mode. And I'll paint the shadow right here as well. All right, so that'll do right there. Now that I have my shadows painted, obviously these look really harsh, so I need to fix them. There's a couple of things I need to do. First, I'll add a Gaussian blur to this, and that's going to blur out the sort of jaggedness of the shadows as they stand currently. And then I'm going to add a layer mask so that the portions of the shadow that overlap with the buildings are then hidden, and that's going to make this look more realistic as if it's a building shadow. So let's start with that Gaussian blur. So I'll go to Filters, Blur, Gaussian blur, and I'm just going to turn this up a little bit. I don't want to overdo it, and you can see that as I do that, it's making these shadows look a little bit better. You can see them right there. So we'll go with maybe about 10 or 11. Let's go with 11, and I'll click OK. Next, I want to add a layer mask in the same shape that I had before from this layer here on our text, because the shadows are going to be the same shape of the building, but we don't want them actually overlapping the building. And because we painted with the layer mask, any parts that the text was overlapping that building, that's exactly the shape we're going to need for this building shadows layer. So I'll right click and go to Mask to Selection. Then I'll come over here to the building shadows layer, right click, go to Add Layer Mask and choose Selection here and click Add. So that will mask any part that's overlapping with the buildings. And I'll hit Control Shift A to deselect that. The last thing I'll do is, while I'm still on this layer mask and I have my paintbrush set to black, I'm going to hold Control and zoom in with my mouse wheel, make sure I have my brush tool selected, and I'm just going to brush out any parts that are maybe coming off the buildings that don't need to be there in terms of the shadow. So really any of the excess here. So pretty much anywhere where it doesn't make sense for there to be a shadow. So the shadow should only be on the text. All right, so once we've cleaned up the shadows there, that's pretty much our final result. The last thing I'm going to do is just crop this to a 4:5 aspect ratio. That's an aspect ratio commonly used for social media such as Instagram. So now I'm just going to grab the crop tool and make sure this is set to 4:5. Make sure allow growing is turned off if you had that turned on earlier. And then I'm just going to click and drag this to crop this. And I'll center this up here. I have my crop guides turned on right now, so this is set to golden sections. And I'll just make sure this is nice and centered here on our design, like so. And then I'll click to apply the crop. There's actually one more thing I want to do, and that is add a drop shadow to this text. So if I hold Control and zoom in, I just want to make the text a little bit more legible against the lighter sky here. So I'll click on the text layer, and I'll come over here and go to Filters, light and shadow, drop shadow, and you'll see that'll add a drop shadow here. So I'm just going to turn down the X and Y values here. I just want these to be slightly offset from the text. And you can also adjust the opacity of the drop shadow here. I'll turn this to somewhere around 0.45-ish. So here's a before, here's an after. If you're using a newer version of GIMP, the drop shadow should automatically go outside the text layer there. So now I'll come over here and click OK. And the drop shadow got a little cut off there. That's all right for the sake of this tutorial. And there's the final result. All right, so that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, you could check out my YouTube channel at youtube.com/daviesmediadesign. Don't forget to click the bell icon to be notified each time I have a brand new tutorial. You can also check out any of the links to my resources in the description of the video. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.